time to go to court. Today on Things Above.
Who wants to go to court? What brings you to court today, sir? I gave somebody the New Jersey salute, and it was an undercover cop. Who wants to go to court? Nobody wants to go to court. I'll spend 1,000 days anywhere else than that. But not when it comes to God's court, because there you're cleansed. There you're forgiven. There you get to worship the Lord in the beauty of His holiness, and you're sent away feeling as though everything is different now because God met with you and loves you.
Jersey Shore Calvary Chapel welcomes you to Things Above with Pastor John Durante. We hope you had a wonderful Christmas celebration this past week. On this final broadcast of 2018, we bring you a second half of a message centered around something we should all be doing, not just around Christmas time, but all year round, worshiping God. The plain fact is we all worship something or someone. It might be a fancy home or a decked out car or even a person. But the only person worthy of our worship is God Himself and His only Son, Jesus Christ. Pastor John is going to remind us today that we don't get to decide who God is. God is who He has always been, and there is only one God. And we should always be in an attitude of worship. How? Well, here's Pastor John with today's message beginning in Isaiah chapter 6.
Verse 4, again, Isaiah giving us a recounting of his memory of these events. He says, "The posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the whole house or the whole temple was filled with smoke." We know that the temple had the incense there, and these were symbolic of prayers rising up in the presence of God. And all this is being taken in by Isaiah as he sees and he hears and he feels the very threshold and the doorpost and everything shake at the voice of the angels as they declare the holiness of God. And verse 5 is then revealed for Isaiah the first time, where he talks about how it then affects him to see God. We have the angels' testimony of how it affected them. What about Isaiah? How did it affect him? He says this, "Woe is me, for I am undone." Woe is me. The word woe is a term of judgment. Woe means judgment. So what is Isaiah saying? I judge myself. I am judging myself. Why? Because I've seen a holy God. I judge myself. In fact, he says so much so, I am undone, he declares. What does that mean? I'm in pieces. It's going to take a holy God to put the pieces back together again. I'm so undone. I can't put myself back together. I'm undone. The presence and the understanding and the visage of a holy God has left me in pieces. Why? Because I'm a man of unclean lips. That is, that the very meditations of the heart, and from the meditations of the heart is through which or what the mouth will speak. Everything I've come here to talk to God about, or everything that I would think I would say to God, is sin. There's nothing good in me. I'm undone. And I'm a man of unclean lips, and I come from a people of unclean lips. My agenda is my agenda, and it's brought judgment upon me. I dwell in the midst of people of unclean lips. Why? How does he know this? How could he possibly come to this conclusion about himself and his people? I have seen, my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Worship begins with an understanding of the nature and the character of God, as it reveals the nature and character of ourselves. We throw ourselves at him on the basis of his mercy and his grace, like Isaiah and Moses. Well, we know the end of this story in Isaiah 6. We know that Moses has his lips cleansed as one of the angels flies and takes coal from the altar, touches his lips and cleanses him, which is the very heart of God. Not that we would remain in a state of constant self-judgment, but that we would be cleansed by going into his presence. This, to me, is a perfect picture of the psalm which says, "Better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere." I just came here from Maui. I could think of 1,000 places on Maui alone that's better than any court in the world. Who wants to go to court? What brings you to court today, sir? I gave somebody the New Jersey salute, and it was an undercover cop. Who wants to go to court? Nobody wants to go to court. I'll spend 1,000 days anywhere else than that. But not when it comes to God's court, because there you're cleansed. There you're forgiven. There you get to worship the Lord in the beauty of His holiness, and you're sent away feeling as though everything is different now because God met with you and loves you. The very same God that in Exodus chapter 34 we read, who is gracious and merciful and long-suffering and patient and kind and goodness, abounding to everyone, abounding to anyone who would believe. Well, you know, we have in the New Testament, in the New Covenant, a revelation of the presence of God that took on a different form. That is, we have Jesus, who came to also teach us what it means to worship the Father. And I'll continue to explain what I mean by that as you turn now to John chapter 4. That is a conversation Jesus has with the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, where they talk about the very subject of worship. But Jesus is coming now in human flesh, because we understand from Moses' experience that no man can see the Father face to face and live. How will we receive Jesus? How can we see Him? Well, let me give you a clue. Jesus made Himself for a short period of time to be less or lower than a time with which He was formerly associated in eternity, His fullness of His glory. How do I know that? The book of Hebrews says that He, for a time, made Himself to be lower than the angels. Read John chapter 17, the high priestly prayer, where He prays the Father that He would receive Him once again to the glory He once had before the world was. Jesus came to be less than the fullness of the glory He formerly once knew. He has now been restored to that place of glory, but for a time, we use these words, He veiled Himself in human flesh. He had to put a veil over Himself, human flesh, so that He could walk amongst us, so that He could live a sinless life, so that He could pay the price for our sins and rise from the grave and thereby give us the ability to be saved ourselves, have power over death through the resurrection. And in this conversation in John chapter 4, which, by the way, we're about to celebrate, we should be preparing ourselves now for Christmas. What happened at the manger? Actually it was 1.5 to 2 years later or so, somewhere around there, the wise men came from the east, 500 miles across the desert. They brought gifts. They worshiped Him by bringing, there's nothing too valuable to give to this new king, this baby who came to earth. And that was another example of worship. But here in John chapter 4, a little bit of background on the story. I taught this recently, but I'm going to go over this section again. But see, here's what's going on. You have a Jewish man named Jesus, right? He's 100% Jewish. And here he is. He's wandering in the northern part of Canaan, the northern part of Israel. And he's at a well, apparently at the top of a hill or a mountain, somewhere near the top of a hill or a mountain. And he comes across a Samaritan woman. Now, Jesus had nothing to draw water with, but she did. And he's talking to her about physical water. And he turns the conversation kind of on its heels and says, well, I have water to drink, which if you were to drink of it, you'd never thirst again. And she's bewildered and confused. He reveals to her that he knows things about her that there's no way he should be able to know. From all this, she perceives that he's not just an average person, that he has insight from heaven. Well, who are the Samaritans? Well, the Samaritans were of mixed race. You see, in the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament, there were some of the Jews that dwelt in the north that mixed together with other races or nations, which they were not supposed to do. And those offspring became the Samaritans. And that's why the Jews would have nothing to do with them. But here Jesus boldly walks right up to this woman, proclaiming that I see no distinction or difference between us, and I'm not only going to embrace you, I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to engage in a conversation with you. And she now understands him to be something extra special or different, and this is the question she asks. Look at verse 19. Well, first she declares, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Okay, so the thing number one, she has some Jewish background. She understands that the prophets were those who God, the Father in heaven, spoke to the fathers through the prophets. We learned that from Hebrews 1. And so She sees him as a prophet, someone who's getting revelation from God in heaven and can now answer the most burning question that she might have in her heart to answer at this moment. I have the ear of a prophet. What will I ask? Listen. I perceive that you are a prophet. Verse 20, our fathers worshipped on this mountain. You Jews say that it's in Jerusalem on a different mountain. That's the place where one ought to worship. Question number one, most important question she wants to ask is how or where do we worship? What's the right way to worship? She understands the significance or importance of worship and wants to know the answer to this burning question. You Jews say it's Mount Zion in Jerusalem. My fathers say, no, it's here. Well, they wouldn't be welcomed in Zion, on Zion, right? This is Jesus' answer, verse 21. Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor on Mount Zion in Jerusalem worship the Father. And then he changes the subject a little bit. He says, still talking about worship though, he says, you worship that which you do not understand, you do not know. You worship without knowledge. But hey, listen, at least she's worshiping. At least there's a desire to worship, which is, I believe, why Jesus is even having this conversation, because this woman wants to understand worship. Jesus will go out of his way to meet with somebody who wants to understand worship. Guaranteed. Every time. We worship what we know. Why? We know what we worship. Why? For salvation is of the Jews. Hold on a second. Jesus just threw a whole new word in here. As I made the point earlier, Jesus is now proving that salvation and worship are directly connected.
How are they connected? We'll find out in the second half of today's message. Things Above is made possible through the generous support of our listeners. Simply put, we can't do it alone, and look to the Lord as our great provider. When you give during the month of December, we'll say thanks by sending you either a Things Above t-shirt or a thumb drive that contains all of John's studies in Romans, whichever you'd prefer. And half of your donation will go to a missions outreach. Check it out or even give to the ministry online at thingsaboveradio.com. Let's get back to Pastor John for the answer to the question, how are worship and salvation linked?
The very first time you ever worshiped, if you are saved, if you are going to heaven when you die, the very first time you ever worshiped God is when you came to him, you saw him for who he is, you saw yourself for who you are, you saw a need for forgiveness, and you worshiped him. Salvation is of the Jews. Yes, Mount Zion's important, but he's going to go on to say that doesn't matter where anymore. You're going to be able to worship anywhere. A time is coming and now is. Look what it says. Continue with me there. Verse 23, the hour is coming and now is when true worshipers, hold on a second, there's another word being thrown into the equation that changes the meaning of worship. He says that true worship, what do you mean, Jesus? If you use the word true in front of the word worship here, it necessitates the understanding and comprehension that there's a such thing as false worship. If there's a such thing as true worship, it means that there has to be a such thing as false worship. Folks, there's a lot of that going on. And we're going to learn what that means through Jesus' words here. True worship. Neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, but the hour is coming and now is when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. There's plenty of spiritual worship out there. But a lot of it, the vast majority of it, is not in line with truth. Why? Because they're not worshiping God. A lot of them think they are. If they were truly worshiping God, they would see themselves truly for who they are. And there'd be repentance and humility and truth, bearing, the marks of truth in their lives, discipleship, change. That's true worship. You see, we don't get to decide who God is. That's not worship, True worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. And hold on a second, because the Father himself is actually seeking such to worship him. He's not passively statically sitting around waiting for people to come without any effort. He's actually out there looking for those to worship him. And he says in verse 24, Jesus does, he says, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. How are we to maintain truth and spirit worship? Well, the early church practiced both spiritual worship and truth worship. They continued in the apostles' doctrine, Acts chapter 2, verse 42. They fellowshiped with one another, koinonia fellowship. We're not just talking about hanging out with each other. We're talking about being transparent, confessing their sins one to another, bearing with one another in love. They prayed together regularly, continuing steadfastly in koinonia fellowship, prayer, the apostles' doctrine. In verse 47, they praised God. They spoke to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, making music melody in their hearts to the Lord. They worshiped the Lord. That's why in church services, we try to include some part of all four of those things. We call them the four pillars of the church because they are all worship. Continuing the apostles' doctrine means, as the apostles taught what the commandments looked like lived out in the life of a person of brokenness and humility and dependence on God to line up with the commandments, they practiced that in their services. 1 John 2, verse 3 says this on the subject of the commandments and maintaining our awareness of the truth. Now by this we know, this is 1 John chapter 2, verse 3 through 6. By this we know that we know him. Confidence in our relationship with God. By this we know that we know him, if we keep his commandments. Keep his commandments. That is, as we preserve the commandments alive, just like Isaiah did when he said, "Woe is me, for I am undone." Not that we perfectly satisfy the righteous requirements of the law, but that we judge ourselves when we fail, just like Isaiah did. I'm a man of unclean lips. I come from a people of unclean lips. John goes on to write, he who says I know him and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. Those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. But if we do not keep ourselves under the commandments, accountable to them in humility, the truth is not in us. But whoever keeps his word, truly the love of God is being perfected. Did you hear what he just said? The love of God is being perfected in the person who brings judgment upon themselves. That's why going into the presence of the courts of the Lord are so great. Because you bring judgment upon yourselves, and going to the courts of the Lord, what does God do? Perfect his love in you in exchange. You want the love of God? Bring yourself into accountability to the truth of God. The love of God will be abounding in you. That's a pretty decent exchange, I would say. I bring him my junk, he takes it from me and fills me with his love and sends me on my way. I can't think of anything better than that. Whoever keeps his word, truly the love of God is perfected, and by this we know that we are in him. He who says he abides in him ought himself also to walk in the same manner in which he also walked. Speaking of Jesus there, John is. I'm going to close the message today with some lyrics from Keith Green's Letter to God. And I first was preparing to teach this message. This message came about while I was in the Philippines preparing to teach at Calvary Chapel Dumaguete. And I came across these lyrics because my wife posted them on her Facebook page, and I saw them there, and I hijacked them for my message. And they've been part of this message in the Philippines and in Maui. And everywhere I've gone, this message has been received well, and so that's why I decided to share it with you today. But listen to what Keith Green wrote. And by the way, you'll note very carefully that everything I'm saying in my message today, Keith Green experienced in the being given these words. He was in the presence of God, or desiring the presence of God as a result. I see Keith Green not just as a songwriter. I know a lot of you are familiar with Keith Green because you're old, and if you don't know who he is, you're not. He wasn't just a songwriter. He was a prophet. I see other guys like this too, guys and gals. I see Rich Mullins, a very similar character in recent Christian history, more of a musical prophet. I see Phil Wickham the same way a lot today as a musical prophet. Not that these guys aren't worship leaders. They write words that say things that we think and feel, but we don't have the words. They give us the words of worship. We don't have it. They have it. God gives it to them to give to us. And that's the prophecy that they give. But look at this, what it says. Listen to what it says. You'll recognize the choruses. You might not recognize one of the verses I'm going to share, but he says, "O Lord, you're beautiful." Reminds me of David. Worship the Lord in the beauty of his holiness. "Your face is all I see. For when your eyes are on this child, your grace abounds to me. I see you, you see me. I then am in a state of grace, receiving the grace that you have for me, that you abound in so much when your eyes are on me." And this verse, I've not often heard this verse sung, but he says this: "I want to take your word," the apostles' doctrine, the commandments, "and shine it all around. But first, help me to just live it, Lord." In other words, I want so desperately, just like Moses, just like Isaiah, to take your word, to take your truth, and have others also be put in the light of your truth. But I don't want to do so until such a time as I have lived it out myself first. Humility, brokenness, dependence on God. And then he says, "And when I'm doing well," completely different subject here. "When I'm doing well, help me to never seek a crown, for my reward is giving glory to you." I don't want, when everything's going great in my life, I don't want people to admire me or think good things of me. I want somehow for them to see me doing well as you're doing, God. I'm doing well because you're using and blessing me. Then he says, "O Lord, please light the fire that once burned bright and clean. Replace the lamp of my first love that burns with holy fear." There's something I once had and I want it again. I want that fire, Lord. I'm even willing to be burnt if it means being brought to that place of sense of awe of your presence in my life. Worship is so important to me, I don't mind getting a little burnt because to get there. I want to worship you, Lord. And if I got to be fried in oil like a turkey in Thanksgiving, I don't care. I just want to worship, Lord. Worship means something to us in this moment. And then again he says, "I want to take your word and shine it all around, but first help me to just live it, Lord. And when I'm doing well, help me to never seek a crown, for my reward is giving glory to you. O Lord, you're beautiful. Your face is all I see. For when your eyes are on this child," and now he changes the word grace to faith. He says, "Your faith abounds in me." The very real and the very true suggestion here that as we spend time worshiping God, we're given greater faith. Grace is poured out upon us. The righteousness of God is given to us simply by worshiping him, because righteousness is a relational reality. And seeking the presence of God in our worship is how he will make us holy like he is. Amen?
Hey, thanks for being a part of today's broadcast. This is Things Above, a presentation of Jersey Shore Calvary Chapel in Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey. Would you like to hear Pastor John Durante's message again? We'd be happy to send a CD copy out to you. Go to thingsaboveradio.com or call 732-892-4648. Again, 732-892-4648. If you'd prefer to go the route of the U.S. mail, here's our mailing address. P.O. Box 1322, Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey, 08742. When you support this radio ministry financially, we'll take half of your donation and use it to support a different missionary outreach each month. Check out our December Ministry Spotlight partner on the front page of our website, thingsaboveradio.com. And when you give this month, we'll say thanks by sending you a Things Above t-shirt featuring the Things Above logo, or a thumb drive with Pastor John's complete series through the book of Romans. The nice thing about that is you can send it back and load up more messages at a later date. For all the details, go to thingsaboveradio.com and click the online giving button. You'll also notice Pastor John's message is archived there as well. Again, you can find us on the web at thingsaboveradio.com. Come worship with us during the Christmas season. Here at Jersey Shore Calvary Chapel, we meet Saturday nights at 6:30 and Sunday mornings at 9 and 10:45. We also have a midweek Bible study on Wednesday evenings at 6:30. The church is located at 708 McLean Avenue in Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey. We can give you directions and more information online at thingsaboveradio.com or call 732-892-4648. We've been on the air about a year now, and as this year draws to a close, we'd like to ask a favor of you. And that is just to send us an email to let us know you're listening and if you're helped by this radio ministry. That would be so encouraging to us. Our email address is thingsaboveradio@gmail.com. Again, thingsaboveradio@gmail.com. We appreciate you joining us today. Please be with us next time as our series in the awesome book of Romans continues here on Things Above with Pastor John Durante. And remember to set your mind on things above.